Windhorse is our innate ability to uplift ourselves and our environment by giving rise to a positive energy that is both relaxed and disciplined. Since 1981, Windhorse Community Services has integrated this understanding with modern conventional therapies, meditation, and contemplative traditions in the development of at-home, whole-person mental health recovery. Windhorse Journal is dedicated to the mission of communicating decades of clinical and personal experience to professionals, educators, students, and anyone seeking recovery options. Please join the dialogue.
Welcome to Windhorse Journal Entry 59, Windhorse Leadership Seeking Health, Sanity, and Balance During COVID-19. This week, we return to part 2 of the discussion published on May 16th, Lungta in the Time of Corona, Leadership During a Crisis. This recording took place on the 1st of May 2020 and brings together leaders of Windhorse Community Services and its sister entity, Windhorse Elder Care. They discuss numerous approaches to maintaining wellness while in isolation, as well as trust within vulnerability. Let's listen now to Journal Entry 59, Windhorse Leadership Seeking Health, Sanity, and Balance During COVID-19, with Banerjee Gallagher, Jack Gipple, and Stephanie Kindberg, joined by moderator Chuck Knapp.
Welcome everyone to the Windhorse Journal. This morning we're hosting a discussion about taking care in this time of pandemic, and particularly how to take care of our minds and health. And Stephanie, you mentioned getting up in the morning and going to bed at night with a certain kind of intentionality of mind and working with tuning into how you're doing and offering prayers to others and so on, to the kitchen level standpoint of how Dzigar Kongtrul is presenting how to take care of yourself. Set up a way that works for you, your clothing, your rhythms, your food, which is all easy to drift when you lose stability of points like we have. And it just makes me wonder, have you all had any particularly difficult emotional or experiences or states of mind that have come up in the context of this? I know I have, and I'd be curious if you have and how you've dealt with those.
What comes to my mind is a potential for more depression and a sense of isolation and loneliness that can turn more negative from the perspective of that this isn't okay to be feeling these things. And I was speaking with my sister, Rupa, who my parents live with her in Austin, and we started to speak more about exchange. It's a different kind of exchange that can happen in the context of where she is. She's in the house all the time where, my parents are elderly, they have their level of suffering and also depression and physical pain. And she started to speak about how she was feeling all of this heaviness. And I was relating with her as well. It's like the heaviness that can come from, I have to really watch what I'm letting in way of news, for instance. I've actually started to take a day off from news because I was like hyper vigilant. I wanted to make sure our communities were getting the right information. So I'm scouring through this news and that, and what do I listen to? And I started to feel really flooded. And that, to me, had this sense of kind of this heavy depression starting to form. So my sister and I were talking about, there's a tendency to want to fix it or make it go away. Like, this isn't okay. We shouldn't be feeling this. And at some level of self-talk, trying to bring us back online with, doing more physical activity maybe, or talking to ourselves about this isn't going to be forever. This is also has its own quality of impermanence. Also talking about watching this depression instead of like trying to make something out of it. At first acknowledging that it's there, because there is a level of deep sadness for us, acknowledging it together. And somehow we felt some sense of connection and ease with talking about it together, that we don't have to make it go away, but can we just allow it to be there? Because all the lives that are lost, right, in this kind of unpredictable way where family members aren't able to be in person together, that just is so painful to hear. And that's something I feel like I want to let in, right? So for me, working with depression has to do with acknowledging this part of it And then in the particular example with my sister, that we are going through this. And then touching back on our prior conversation about we're in this together, that seems to always help me. Like, it's not just a lip service thing. For the first time in my life, it really is so poignant what that really means now that we're in this together. So for me, the level of depression, and sometimes towards the evening, I can have more of this, partly because I'm tired, partly because, maybe I'm letting more news come in. So I have to watch how I'm doing my evenings. So instead, maybe I go for a walk, or as Stephanie was saying, reflecting, having more of this attitude of like maybe meditation or some kind of prayer that can come in. I've also been trying to integrate and using the time that we have towards the end of the day doing that.
I was feeling a lot of physical buildup, being really pinned down in the house, and I would have days that went by where I moved between 4 or 5 rooms in my house. And then at the same time, I felt like I spent the whole day, like one day, the max day I think I had was 9 hours on video Zoom calls to 15 people. And it was like bang, 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 bang in a row. So there's this weird disconnect of feeling like I've been all over in everybody's room, like even sitting here with you all and looking at the screen. I'm not, a part of me is not even in the room I'm in. I'm in the room that I'm seeing myself in, and I'm in the room that I see each of you in. And then you multiply that through a day and through time, and it can be just kind of blows my sensation out. And then I realize I haven't even moved my physical body out of like 5 rooms of my house. It's really quite a contrast. and I think especially in the early weeks, and it was more winter here, and we had a series of storms and cold spells, and my body, my upper back was killing me, especially for hunching over these screens, which always, it's some reason, like I sometimes I'll put it up on something so it's actually at eye level, but like today it's down a little bit, so I'm like, a whole day of this, and you start to just curl forward, and then all this anxiety builds up, and quite physically. And then add on to it, I was binging national and mostly national news, and a lot of and things that were some of my common news sources were just off the charts alarming, and it wasn't even contributing a lot of factual information. It was alarm. I've learned I have to really watch my media hygiene, if you will. It's like I've had really bad media hygiene for a while. I was just, when I wasn't specifically focused on work, poring over news things, and that was definitely making my kind of felt body toxic. So I think that's been important, to ground and not get my states of mind obliterated and scattered to all directions. And I'm much better at that. And lately, when it's warm and the springtime is coming on us, even though we had a terrible, to me this is a loss, is like we had a terrible killing storm that just wiped out. There will be no apple or fruit blossoms this year. I'm sorry. That's it. Boulder is not going to have any. And that to me is sad, but it's kind of poignant and appropriate that we'd have this kind of killing storms. But as it opens up and it becomes warm and beautiful, it's easier to walk, and it's easier to be in my body and stretching.
You've all been really attending to the health that you know about what's healthy for you, watching yourself get thrown off a little bit, and then how do you come back? Your health starts to assert itself, and your practice habits like that, healthy habits can really help us with stability of all of our, body, speech, and mind. And I have a hunch, if your experience is anything like mine, there have been times when you felt particularly vulnerable, like spikes of things, and maybe more than just one or two, because daily I know myself, I can have times where fear, fatigue, stress, different kinds of things kind of slam into me. And Stephanie, you and I talked a little bit about this yesterday, about times when you feel particularly vulnerable. I'm just wondering if you want to speak to some of that.
Sure, I can speak to when I feel like the business felt very vulnerable, and then when as an individual, felt very vulnerable. To begin with the business, when this whole thing began March 13th, we had 70% of our clients suspend services immediately.
Wow.
which is huge loss for us. So we, of course, as a business, felt very vulnerable, and we continue to feel vulnerable because we don't know how long this is going to last. So that's been challenging to work with, for sure. But then for myself, I have felt the most vulnerable when I've been working with our clients in the nursing homes. I've had to cover some shifts with some of the clients we still are working with, because we are considered essential workers with people who are on hospice or need 24/7 care. And because initially when some of us got sick or decided they didn't want to work in this situation, I had to jump in and cover some shifts for people who cannot be left alone. So I have a story I'd like to share with you. I was working with a woman in a memory care home, and she's only 63 years old, but she has stage 3 frontal lobe dementia. And we do 24/7 care with her. And when you are surrounded by people who have, cognitive issues, a lot of them have dementia, there is no social distancing. There is no, really good hygiene. I mean, they're not able to wear masks or gloves. So being in that situation with so many people, so many vulnerable people, makes me feel very vulnerable. So at one point, I was working with this woman and her husband. I called him up and I was holding my phone, and she was, talking with him, and she grabbed the phone out of my hand. And he was talking, having a nice conversation, and she was following along. And suddenly she took my phone and she started kissing it. And she was kissing my phone towards her husband. And it was so interesting watching my mind, because initially I got really nervous. I thought, well, oh my gosh, I'm going to have to take it from her, and she's had her lips and her tongue all over my phone. So anyway, then suddenly I just shifted my mind and I said, how touching. Like, I felt so moved and so touched by the fact that they were having this moment together. And, I was just like, I just had to let go of any kind of tightness I had around infection and hygiene. And I was just like, I just had to let it go. And so it was an interesting moment. And then after that, I was able to relax. I was doing a 7-hour shift. And this happened at the beginning. And I'm so glad it happened when it did, because then I was able just to relax and just let go. I just had to. I had no other choice. And we had a really nice time. And I had a nice time with some of the other residents there as well. I did feel, honestly, a sense of relief, but I was so grateful that I had that moment and I was able to, to work with her during that time.
It's a gorgeous story that just brings together, the tender heart, the isolation and horror and compassion. Little sandwich there. That was good. Any other vulnerable points for y'all?
Well, I think what Stephanie said, I mean, it is different layers of vulnerability. Vulnerability of the fact that our health, not just our health, but the people around us who may be more compromised, because it's hard to know how people are going to react or respond if and when we get COVID-19. So I think the vulnerability is just that. I think Stephanie's story, that our minds can go to this place of like, oh my gosh, I can't have this with germs and all this on my phone. But I really appreciated that story, because the love and the connection that she showed, that trumps it. And I'm sure you also wiped your phone down. So the practicality of all of it, right? So the vulnerability that we can share, and then also if we know how to care for ourselves, you know how to care for other people, masks and things, that's what's happening right now, and that can help us to feel maybe a little less physically vulnerable.
Washing
your hands. 20 seconds.
Yes, right.
Washing your phone, washing your hands.
Yeah.
So like I said earlier, my daughters both, and my wife and I, so the four of us in the house, then we had two dogs, and one of them was especially old and was kind of in the last stages of her life and aging out. And there was kind of this ordinary grief where in the middle of this shut in, and we had a whole week. There was this snowstorm I was talking about earlier, and it was in that week that our dog died. And so it's weird to have this kind of appropriate grief in the family with all of us there. And then there's, and for time before that, she had been declining, and just taking care of this old dog, helping them take care of their bodily needs at the end is a whole issue. And so having that layered in with all of this, and in some ways there was a great kind of gift. I often find there is some gift in grief. Grief can be very synchronizing. It brings things together. Dogs to me are also like eras, like I divide my life up into 15 years, segments that have been the spans of some dog's lifetime. And so it's always a poignant thing too. So that was it was definitely a stress. It can blow you apart or it can bring you together. And I think we were able to have it bring us together. And it was very difficult and challenging in the week of it. So
you all alluded to this earlier in this conversation about the recognizing our own homes, our work environments, and then there's this enormous world out there with various levels of vulnerability and trauma going on out in communities. And the through lines that have been in all of what we've been discussing is the isolation, connection, kind of paradox, and what that's done to our awareness of ourselves and in our world. And wondering in particular about relationships and thinking about how we keep ourselves healthy and in balance. Are there particular kinds of relationships and examples of relationships that would be good to talk about as ways that you all have kind of kept yourself in balance?
Because I connect with a lot of people, and a lot of my function and work is connecting individuals and working clinically with individuals and then teams and then supervising people around the organization and then groups of people. So there's a lot, and I'm kind of between, the ways of being, and it's been really important to have some people I can really be more unedited with, honestly. And I think that's always true. It's always important to have people you can just say, okay, I'm going to go on for a while now. Okay, so just bear with me. And they're not going to judge. They're just going to let the energy roll. Mm-hmm. And like I can do that, with my kids really, and I can also do it with my work colleagues. Many of them, what's appropriate and what level. But without that, I don't think I could be without those kind of relationships where I can be unedited and just let it rip. I use that kind of relationship to kind of true myself, and that it's so important to not just always be kind of sanitizing my thinking and feeling into some kind of idealized thing. I have to be real about what I'm actually going through. And I feel very fortunate that my work and my personal life are just full of these, that's a privilege I enjoy, because that is not always common for people. And I think without that, I think it'd be really hard to true oneself again and spinning evenly instead of with a big wobble. I mean, that's how I true my spin, I suppose.
I agree, Jack. One of the things that I try to keep in my relationships is I have a sister who lives in Boulder, as well as my nephews and my brother-in-law, and we had a dinner every week for dinner, no matter what. We would get together and we would have a conversation where we would take turns just sharing state of our minds. It was really a wonderful flow that I always enjoyed. It felt like such a loss. We set up Zoom calls where we actually have dinner and talk. So that level of like trying to continue to keep in touch. I mean, I have to admit, it's definitely not the same. I really want to hug my nephews, especially, but at the same time, they stayed with it. They engaged, and I think we've had times where my work colleagues will get together, and at the end of a Friday, we'll just have a drink together, happy hour. We get to share more of what's going on for us in those kinds of relationships, and then continuing on with our friends too, that we have a connection from a spiritual perspective, continuing to share that. I'm actually pretty amazed by how much we can still do online. It doesn't take away from wanting to be in person. I mean, in Windhorse, we talk about this level, of exchange, and so much of that is based on being in the environment at the same time. So I'm curious what this level of online relationship changes are. But I guess the last thing I'll say is I'm just extremely appreciative that we have this opportunity, how quickly we've been able to change to this mode of functioning to continue to support our clients, each other. So I'm really grateful that we can do this still.
Yeah, and I actually have felt more connected to some people than I have felt in the past, even though we're only able to connect through Zoom or on the telephone, which has brought a lot of meaning to my life. And I think we come together more strongly when we're all going through a difficult time together, which brings more connection and meaning as well. And we also have been having some Zoom birthday parties, which have been fun as well to acknowledge birthdays and anniversaries and things like that.
The intentionality, I really hear the intentionality here, sense of how important this is to stay connected in good and safe people that are safe to talk with, and that, like in my experience, who are also really honest with me and will help me. Feels like I'm going off the tracks in one way or another. They don't just believe my storyline, and but help me keep perspective and awareness about how my mind works sometimes in not such functional ways. This reminds me of perhaps the last thing we'll talk about, which is our natural inclination toward health, which is it's a very basic Windhorse principle. That I think all beings, all people, a natural inclination toward health and actually sanity and balance. And I'm just curious if you all have experiences where you found yourself getting more out of balance and feeling your urges toward health start to pull you back up. Yeah. And I'm curious what you'd have to say.
There's
about
something about the energy. And I think that's earlier what I was saying of the way I can use people who I can really be really honest with where I'm feeling and thinking and experiencing. It's like going with the energy. Sometimes it actually takes quite a bit of kind of a radical trust. You have to trust the energy. It's like when you're driving a car at night down a road you've never been, you kind of trust that the road's going to keep going. Maybe you're going 45 at your headlights and you're doing a windy 2-lane highway. You just trust that the road will keep presenting itself in a way, trusting the world isn't going to suddenly throw a missing bridge in your way or do a ridiculous right up in the middle of the woods. Of course, there are times that kind of happens in life, but there's something about trusting and going into the energy and the people and the environment around, even when it's not possible to see exactly where it's going, but trusting the flow of the energy and the momentum of the energy. Or maybe it's like I grew up in snow country where when you lose control of a car in Minnesota and you go into a skid, you have to respond by going with the energy of the skid. If you try to interrupt it, then you'll end up in the ditch. But there's an interesting way that you have to go with and into the energy of the skid. And I think this works, is I'm trusting the flow and the integrity of yourself and the people around you and the environments, and the momentum of the energy wants to naturally true itself. There is something about your natural tendency back towards systems truing themselves. I think in biology and environmental things, they call that the urge toward, is it homeostasis or maintaining homeostasis? There's kind of a urge in that direction.
So despite how much uncertainty and there is both personally, perhaps in our work world, as well as in the world as a whole, there is a tendency in what you're describing to come back into balance and having some trust in that.
That only works, I think, if you're really honest with the conditions that are at hand. It's kind of the beauty of the whole situation is if you're lying to yourself about the conditions at hand, you have to stay even more present and listen even more closely to what are the conditions at hand because you're missing something. And then at some point you'll go, oh, you'll kind of know when you're really honest about all the conditions at hand, then I think it clears the way for this natural truing to happen. So
yeah. Holly, Stephanie, any thoughts?
Well, I was thinking sometimes, one may not be aware of when we are as open or honest with ourselves. So it's a practice. And I think that's the contemplative aspect, reflecting on your own mind and understanding it more. And I think one of the aspects that's been coming up for me is acknowledging that there is some level of trauma that's associated with what's happened, because we've all gone into something together. Not that we're all going to just live there, but that resonates with me with what you're saying, Jack, of, well, so can we acknowledge that some really amazing things have come out of this potentially, and that we can get it from a traumatic perspective of how our minds could hold on. And then what can happen is, especially we've talked about this in Windhorse, is there is this own basic goodness, inclination towards health that naturally we feel drawn to. So that's where we start to practice to see how does that aspect become more and more apparent to us, and the trauma doesn't have to overtake. And I think where it can really help is for us to realize not to isolate ourselves, even though we're isolated. This has been our conversation all along today, is how do we not isolate in isolation? Is not to make ourselves, like Rinpoche said that's in the podcast too, is not to make ourselves into the only ones going through this. So that's not where we live. Beings that want to connect and own basic goodness in that, it becomes familiar to be able to connect to other people and from that same ground and basis. So I think for me, that's what I'd like to acknowledge, similar to what you're saying, Jack, is looking at, this really shook me up. And at the same time, it's really something that is workable. What is it based on workability is that no matter what, this level of basic goodness is there for us to be able to kind of connect in with.
Well said. The only thing I would add is regarding the contemplative practice that you were speaking about is there's a saying, the only way out is in.
What y'all are reminding me of also is something inherent in our spiritual traditions that Dzigar Kongtrul is coming from, which is that the present moment is actually the safest place. Well, to end, I actually wanted to read the last paragraph of the transcript from the podcast, and I think it really ties out so much of what we're talking about together. So this is Dzigar Kongtrul Rinpoche. This is how I've been relating to this situation, this crisis. I utilize whatever makes me more aware of my vulnerabilities, anxieties, and uncertainties as a means to open up to what everywhere for everyone. This reflection opens you up. It opens your mind and your heart to move toward others. This is what I find to be a truly beneficial experience at this time. For anyone who hasn't heard that podcast, I highly recommend tuning into it, and appreciate everyone joining us today for this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Windhorse Journal is a publication of Windhorse Community Services, supporting recovery from mental health challenges at home and in the community since 1981.